Arts and Culture. This is Clint.
And this is Steve.
And we're excited to be back with you guys for another beautiful summer evening.
It's like living in an oven.
It actually is. If you guys haven't seen the weather in the South recently, it may or may not be in the 90s and 100s.
But you know what's beautiful about it? Is it's not just hot, it's humid.
But
you can swim outside, not just in the pools.
There's the Gulf.
Okay. Anyway, Clint, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
This is wonderful. And
have you taken anything new? I beat you to it.
You did beat me to it. You caught me off guard with it too, you jerk. No, not per se. Pretty much kind of gave it all. I would say, like, this isn't really media, but my parents were in town a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
We went out to San Antonio, and so we got to go to a lot of the historical sites, like the Mission Concepcion, which is like that original mission there.
Yeah.
And we just got to like walk around and see some of the history. And while that's not necessarily a media per se, I think it's also something that, especially some of these old churches, that reflects God.
Yeah.
Because Mission Concepcion was built, hundreds of years ago.
Is that the one that's still operating?
It is.
That's
it's like the old Franciscan was built.
Yeah.
It was built by Franciscans and the indigenous people.
Yeah. I went to Mass there, actually.
Yeah. It's really, really cool.
Yeah. So if you guys ever come to Texas, highly recommend checking out San Antonio. It's probably my favorite city that we have here in Texas.
Honestly, yeah. There's a reason that like I chose that as my area of going to.
Yeah. Yeah. As much as I do enjoy living in Houston, the people, when they come to visit, they're like, oh, what should we go see? And I'm like, I can show you NASA.
Yeah.
And the Gulf. Okay, now what?
Yeah, for me, I think, well, Houston's great. It's a concrete jungle. I like hiking and the outdoors a little bit. And I like all the cool stuff that we have in Houston, but sometimes it's just like, wow, there's just so much stuff, so much concrete.
Yeah.
It's very man-made.
You can go like set up some chairs and watch them build highways.
You can walk on a very flat surface.
Yeah.
And maybe find a bayou with an alligator.
I was talking to Father Clint the other week, and
different Clint.
Yeah, not me.
Clint is neither a priest nor a biological father that I know of.
Definitely not.
Okay, good. Just making sure.
Okay. That was weird. Okay. And we were talking about how hard it is to find places to hike around here. And he says he actually goes to parking garages and hikes there because that's the only place you can find elevation in the city.
That hurts my heart. And we're going to move on. Have you taken any media?
I have, yeah. So I've been watching, I know I mentioned this in previous episodes, but I've been starting to watch some Fortnite on Twitch. I've been watching Bearded Blevins. Do you know who that is?
I've heard the name.
Okay.
Isn't he pretty relatively famous?
Do you know who Ninja is?
I've heard of Ninja.
Okay, so Ninja is like the biggest streamer.
Yeah.
So Bearded Blevins is also a streamer, but it's Ninja's older brother, who is also, he works for a church in...
I think you were telling me this. This is why all these names sound familiar.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I've been watching him...
I'm like wondering, I don't watch Twitch, but all these names sound very familiar.
Yeah.
That's why.
So I've been watching him again. I still don't get Fortnite, but I'm trying to.
My understanding is the video game.
It is, yes. I'm so bad at it. I was talking to my brother today, and I was like, hey, have you ever won Victory Royale, which is like winning the game? So it's basically, there's 100 people, and you're thrown into this island, and it's the last person standing, basically.
Yeah.
It's like, have you ever won Victory Royale? And he's like, yeah, I've won like literally hundreds of times. So it's like, oh, okay. I suck. Please teach me.
Yeah, that's really funny.
And then, so I've been watching him a little bit. Hopefully we can have him on the show in the future. He's a pretty cool guy. And then I don't know if you've been watching our Twitter, but he was talking about playing Pokemon Go. So I added him on Pokemon Go and started playing that again.
Oh, cool.
So,
apparently it's a little different now.
Oh yeah, it's way
it was at
different.
the inception.
It's way different.
One of my coworkers still plays it.
Yeah. Was it the one from Abe?
No. This one is one who listens to our podcast sometimes. Her name is Sandra. Shout out.
Shout out, Sandra. I think we've given Sandra a shout out before.
I think so, but she's good people, so she gets a shout out today as well.
Yeah. So I always say I'm listening to a ton of podcasts. So I've actually been listening to less podcasts. I know, but I started a new one called Start With This. It's actually one that Gordon told me about.
Huh.
It's to help people create things. So how to write, how to create like podcasts, like story podcasts. It's basically just like how to become a storyteller and like create things effectively.
Which is really great because storytelling is how we do lots of stuff.
Yeah.
And to express our encounters with God.
Stories are my thing.
But it's kind of what we do here in this podcast.
Yeah. But because I've been listening to less podcasts, I've actually been listening to more music. And so I went and did something dangerous. I went and listened to hot hits on Spotify, like popular songs.
Yeah.
And I hated most of them because I don't like most of the stuff that's out right now.
Yeah.
But honestly, there's a song out right now that's kind of cheesy, but actually super catchy called Old Town Road.
Yep. I've heard it.
By Lil Nas X and Billy Ray Cyrus. Super catchy. And I may or may not have had it on repeat for the whole day.
A lot of the new interns at work are youngins because they're all in college.
Yep.
They were talking about that song and I like knew it. And they were like, "You know that song?" And I was like, "I mean, I don't live under a rock." And they were teasing me about being old. They were like, "Oh, yeah. I too am hit young fellows." And I was like, "All right, you guys are all dead to me."
Yeah. It's not crazy like good lyrically, but it's super catchy.
Yeah, and I mean, it was just really funny to be like, "Wow, you're too old to hear like a popular song now." And I was like, "Yep, you know me, just ancient."
Basically. And the last one I have is a song called Civil War by Rush. Also pretty good. And I think that's all I got.
All right. Well, a couple weeks ago, almost like a month, or I don't know, it was a while back, the final season of Game of Thrones was on air.
Yeah.
And I did watch that. Please don't judge me. I mean, I guess you can. And I realized that a while back we had talked about a little bit, like touched on some Game of Thrones stuff, and we never had an episode. So I want to preface this by saying, like, regardless of where you guys fall on that, like whether or not you think it's a good show to watch, like I recognize it has a lot of bad things in it. But part of the aim of this podcast is to not necessarily shy away from the controversial, but to show that, like the early apostles, they were not pagans, right? But they listened to the stories of these pagans anyway, and they found where Christ was shining through, right? Because all the stories ultimately are going to reflect it in some way if it's a good story that's trying to do anything. And so even though that was the case, they listened and they were able to point that out, and that's how they evangelized. So at the very least, even if you don't watch the show, you have no intention of watching the show, and you're morally opposed to the show, we hope that you, at least by listening to this, might be able to find some of these themes that you can then help lead some of your pagan friends like us that did watch the show.
Yeah, because the reality is, whether we like it or not, people are watching this, and it's by far the most popular show that's ever been on television. So chances are you know a ton of people who are watching it who are not familiar with the story of Christ and the good news. But hopefully through this conversation, you'll have somewhere where you can breach that topic with them through something that they enjoy.
Yeah.
So even if you're not super familiar with it, that's kind of our hope from this show, is to be able to give you something to reach out to those people with.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really important. And then we'll touch a little bit on the incredibly controversial final season, which a lot of people are mad about. But, I mean, come on, what did we expect? This is a show that had a lot of really bad things that we didn't want to happen.
That's true.
And to expect the ending to be everything we've desired is, I think, to forget what George R.R. Martin was trying to accomplish with the show by showing that, hey, sometimes things don't always work out great, but in the end, they do work out.
Yeah.
Maybe not in the way we necessarily expect or want, which in itself is a spiritual lesson. So we're not going to touch on everything because there's a lot of seasons of really long episodes.
Well, and there's a lot of lore too. I mean, this is, I haven't seen the last season, but George R. R. Martin has so much like content built into this world. Like it's kind of like a high fantasy, right?
Yeah.
Where there's there's so much different stuff built in. There's no way we can cover all of it. So.
Right. So we'll touch on a few, I think, key things that are very prevalent. I think the first one we'll talk about is sort of the Night's Watch, right? Because we mentioned that in the previous episode.
Yeah.
The Night's Watch is this sort of group of men, and it generally consists of outcasts from society, and they go and live at this wall, which is a big ice wall, Castle Black, and they're meant to defend against the White Walkers, right? And, which are like the undead, right? No one's seen them for centuries.
But they don't even believe they exist anymore.
Yeah, people don't even believe they exist anymore, or if they ever existed. And really, it's just to like keep the wildlings, which are these northern barbarians, out from raiding. But they take these vows, that they'll hold no title, they'll hold no lands, they won't get married or have any children. Yeah, we have it pulled up.
Yeah. So the full vow that they take when they are initiated is this: Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life in honor to the Night's Watch for this night and all the nights to come.
And so I think there is some parallel between that and the priesthood.
Yeah, even so, well, we talked about this on the show a while back, where one of our friends actually had a post that it was about the priests.
Yeah.
And it was this oath, but instead of saying the Night's Watch, it says the priesthood.
Yeah. Because it's important to remember that we, as a church, are the beacon of light on the hill. Right? And it's important, and it's so important to pray for our priests because they really are the ones that are, for all intents and purposes, on the front lines, like really fighting Satan in a way. I mean, they're the ones who bring us the sacraments. And so it's important to pray for them. But yeah, I think that parallel is just very clear, right? That there's this self-sacrificing, willing to serve the church, right? Serve the realms of man, but in this case, like serve the church, like serves Christ's people, serve the kingdom of New Jerusalem and New Israel through this sacrifice, right? It's focused on these people and others other than myself. Like you're sacrificing a lot of yourself for the purposes of others.
If we haven't mentioned it yet, obviously there's going to be a lot of spoilers in this. I mean, I'm sure if you're planning on watching, you've probably seen it at this point. But one thing I do want to point out before we dive too heavily into Night's Watch is kind of going off of what you said before, how everyone didn't believe that the White Walkers even existed anymore, right? And so if these men were here for thousands of years and they've had this order that's been there to protect us from this evil, and now after thousands of years no one's seen this evil, and so they don't believe it exists.
Yeah.
That sounds exactly like our perception of evil and Satan and hell now. I forget the stat, but it's a ridiculous number of Catholics and Christians who don't believe hell even exists.
Yeah.
Which is really unfortunate.
Which I think like Satan wants, because he
Exactly.
convinced people that hell doesn't exist, and it's much more easy for people to be lukewarm in their faith.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis talks about that too.
Yeah, because I mean that's like one of the things that's so eerie about Scripture is when Christ's talking about it, he says it's better to be hot or cold, but like to be lukewarm.
I'll spit you out.
Yeah.
Because if you don't believe that Satan is real, if you don't believe hell is real, then you have no motivation to defend yourself against evil things. And so it becomes so much easier to open yourself to be susceptible to all that evil.
Yeah.
Right?
It's true.
And so I just think that it's kind of a pretty obvious reflection into
Yeah.
our own lives.
Going off with Jon Snow, who's one of the main characters, though, he's a member of the Night's Watch. He takes this vow.
Yeah.
He's one of the few who actually takes it very seriously. And it was funny because we mentioned her on the podcast. She actually did an episode for us, Mackenzie. Was very mad that we did that one little section where we talked about Game of Thrones. I might hear about it.
That's fine.
But she brought it up, and I think it's important to recognize it's true. Jon Snow, who does show, I think, a lot of honor. He's a very Christ-like figure in a lot of ways in the show.
Yeah.
He is still human, right? He's not necessarily like a pure Christ figure. But I think back to had a class on modern Catholic literature, and I read a book called The Thanatos Syndrome, and there were a lot of books where the priest was this broken character that was all but apostate, like all but almost apostated. And it was through this story that was being told that they came back. And so there's this section where he's north of the wall, and he starts breaking some of his vows, right? He ends up with a woman, and then later ends up having to kill her because he ends up taking his vows back up, and she's a wildling. He's defending the castle.
And she's attacking.
And it's really, really sad. And it shows, like, yeah, like, that's not a good thing for him to have done. But he's also a broken person.
Yeah.
Right? But...
I mean, look at Peter.
Yeah, right. But he ends up getting stabbed a bunch and dies.
Let's elaborate on that. Okay?
Yeah.
Because, so, I want to go off on kind of talking about the whole Night's Watch, and not just Jon Snow broke his vows. And you kind of hinted at this, but they would sneak away into the local village and spend the night with prostitutes or whatever. Almost all of them broke at least one of the vows at some point. And so
for the most part, like the Night's Watch really wasn't what it intended. It had fallen far from what it is, and I think, in a certain extent, like we even see that today.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah. Because if you look at it, you said when Jon Snow he actually becomes the leader of the Night's Watch.
Yes.
The commander. And that's when he's stabbed. And the people who stab him are not the enemies. They're not the White Walkers or the wildlings. It's the other priests. And so you already hinted at this, but he's supposed, to a certain extent, a little bit of a Christ figure in some ways. And so if in this situation we look at him as a Christ figure, we see this priesthood, this church, turning against their Christ figure, right, through their own corruption. And so I think you're right on the head that the corruption of...
And if you remember, like, what was the big thing against them? Is he was adamant, because he had seen the White Walker, he had seen the Night King. He was adamant that this evil that people didn't believe in, that it existed and was coming, and they didn't want to listen. And so they tried to take him out.
Exactly. And so I think that's real. I'm not saying, obviously, all priests are like that. I'm not saying all the church is like that. But there are definitely people, lay people, clergy, within all levels of the church who I think fall into that category.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is really shown. And I kind of want to show this because it really does show, but he does actually get raised from the dead, which is like such a big, like, okay, this is very clearly...
It's a resurrection. Yeah.
Resurrection. It's very clearly portraying that.
Well,
scene.
And who resurrects it?
This entity called the Lord of Light.
Lord of Light. Bum bum bum.
Yeah.
Which, obviously, I don't know if you're planning on going to that too, but I think the kind of, what is it, the priestess?
Yeah. Melisandre, yeah.
Melisandre, like all the priestesses that are along that are all extremists too, and they make a lot of really awful mistakes on their side too. So
they do.
We see kind of this extremist in that front too. So we definitely see like anything reflecting faith is almost always extremism, and there's what are the new gods?
The seven.
The seven. Like those are about as extreme as you can get too.
Yep.
So.
And it's actually so interesting because in a lot of ways, the Lord of Light is this entity, character, whatever, that is just trying to defeat the Night King. This thing that's this evil entity, right, that is just going to march on the land of the living and snuff out life.
Yeah.
So the Lord of Light is this creature of fire, because the only thing that can kill a White Walker is fire, or they call it dragon glass, which is obsidian, because it's supposed to be like solid fire, right? That's the only thing that can destroy it. And so throughout all of it, you have this Night King in the background. And so you have two stories kind of going on. You have that story, which is Jon trying to convince people that there is this evil, and he raises the dead. So when he kills you, he raises you up. And so his army's growing because they keep killing more and more people.
Yeah.
And he's trying to convince the realms to, hey, there's this threat that's happening, and we need more than just these few people. And then he lets, and this is like why he got killed, he let the wildling on the other side. He's like, we need these barbarians, like we need them on our side.
Well, he sees humanity.
He does.
Right? He's like, they don't deserve to die from this either. They're just trying to survive too.
Yeah.
Like we can we can save them, and by saving them, they might join us.
Yeah, and not only just might join us, but if we don't save them, they too will be a part of this army.
Yeah.
Like they will become our enemies, our real enemies. And so, and everyone's like, look, this Night King doesn't even exist, but these wildlings do, and you're letting our enemies through. He's like, these aren't our real enemies. And how often does Satan want to divide us and make us look at each other as if we're each other's enemies, instead of who the real enemy behind it is? So I think that is really exciting, and I think there's a lot that goes into that. But the other story is this story where
there's so many going on.
It's so true.
That's one of the.
But the big other arc that's happening is the Game of Thrones, right? That the throne is, you have all these factions that are trying to vie to sit on the Iron Throne and become the king, right? Because the king, Robert Baratheon, died. And not everyone believes that his successor, Joffrey, and then later Tom.
There's tons of successors.
Yeah.
It changes hands a lot.
Yeah. That any of them are actually legitimate.
Because they're not.
Right. And so there's all these other more legitimate people that are coming through, and that's kind of where I think a lot of the morally bad stuff comes in, I guess. Right? Where people are like, oh, this show's so bad, look at all this like horrible stuff that's happening. And I agree with you. But I think that's on purpose, because one of the things that Game of Thrones does is it shows even like the dredges of like the worst of humanity and like what we're capable of. And what's important with that is to show like that everyone's so focused on this power and this greed that the Game of Thrones shows what happens when we lose sight of what's really important and we just focus on our own greed and our own self-interest, and it shows just how bad that is.
And lust.
Yeah.
And how that can tear people apart.
Yeah.
I think the family that fits into this the most is probably the Lannister family.
Yeah.
Which is the wealthiest family in the entire land. They also become the most powerful family because the sister marries the king, and then her children become the next kings, and then she becomes the queen. So they have power, they have this lust, because that's where the incest and like all this crazy stuff is happening. And that's where we see the most corruption, the most evil is in that family.
And you actually see her pride to the point, like in the final season, it really shows her pride. Yeah. And we'll get into that later. But
okay. One thing I did want to say though before we move on is there's three siblings. So are they twins?
I think they are.
I think they're twins. So you have to remind me. I don't remember.
Cersei and Jaime,
and then Tyrion.
Yeah.
So Tyrion is
the other one.
Yeah, he's a half.
Yeah, he's a dwarf. They say. Yeah.
So he's a dwarf, and we see that. I would say in the first season, he might almost seem as immoral or even worse than the twins in some ways. Like, he's pretty bad. He's always out. He's never sober. He's always doing something wrong. He's always plotting and scheming. But I don't know what happened in the final season. But when I left, he had made almost a complete turnaround. Like, he doesn't drink. He's actually one of the most moral characters, and we see kind of this redemption, this possible redemption, and actually Jaime too. Jaime eventually realizes the evil within his family, and he turns too.
And so that's something that Game of Thrones does really well. Is it has some of the characters you like become characters you hate, and some of the characters you hate become characters you like.
Right. And it shows something beautiful about like humanity, and also like the power for us,
power of redemption, and how we can change, and how even the best characters can fall. Like even the best of us can stumble and fall, and even some of the worst of us can repent and become great.
Yeah. And
I think that is something that is very prevalent in the show, but also beautiful because it kind of, I think, causes us to think. When I was reading The Name of God is Mercy by Pope Francis, and I mentioned this on the podcast before, but I think really exemplifies in this moment. They were asked, like, what advice do you give new priests when they go into do confession for the first time? And he says to pray and remember all of the times that God has forgiven you, that you've stumbled and God has forgiven you, because it's in remembering God's mercy that we can more adequately give that mercy away.
Right.
And so sometimes you watch these terrible people and see some of them get redeemed, and it reminds you, yeah, you know what, I'm a sinner too, and like I also can find redemption. Like,
Yeah.
regardless. To go, Ike
Yeah.
has a song, and one of my favorite lines in Land of the Rising Sun is,
I love that song.
even if I
Even at
can't
the devil's table.
even at the devil's table. I love that line because it's like, even at the devil's table, no matter how far gone we go, we can always come back.
Yeah.
That God's mercy is still greater than that. And so, but you do see a lot of the. I mean, it is really much. The show very much is a warning for what all of these horrible sort of sins can do. And so you see a lot of horror happening, and then one of the other big main characters, obviously Jon Snow, convinces some people, including Daenerys Targaryen, to come fight for the war, the real war, because like there's this huge war, right? The war for the throne that's happening, and he's saying, no, this isn't even the real war. The real war is coming. Like this is just the folly of man, but the war between life and death is upon us.
Yeah, that makes me think all the way back to even like the first season.
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember, I didn't start watching until probably 4 or 5 seasons in. But when I watched the first season, and everyone else was like this too, when something big happened, like oh my gosh, what was the Starks? Ned Stark.
Yeah.
When Ned Stark died, everyone freaked out, and we realized like, holy cow, this is going to be like no restrictions, like everyone's fair game, and so we see like seeing like all the chaos that's going on in the world, and then we find out the severity of this other war that you're talking about, and everything else that's going on, like the death of Ned, the death of Robert Baratheon, like all these other little things. We finally realize like how small they actually are, and I feel like that's us a lot of times. We're like, oh man, like my life's over. I had a bad day at work. Like, no, you just had a bad day at work.
Yeah.
You know, the real battle is so much bigger than your bad day at work. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm sorry. Like you had a bad day, but that's not the end.
Yeah.
Like there's something so much bigger going on here too, and we got to remember that because we tend to get distracted by these little things and let them control who we are.
Yeah, and so to change shifts, because I think this is a really important arc. A lot of people got mad at this arc, but I think it was a really good character arc when you look back at it.
Which one?
Daenerys Targaryen.
Oh, the final season.
Mm-hmm. So I'll explain. Daenerys Targaryen is this character that you are made to love.
Yeah.
And she has these dragons, and she's overcoming all of this oppression, and then she flies over the sea from Essos into Westeros, which is where it's happening. She plays a pivotal part in the defeat of the Night King, right? And the defeat of the army of the dead. And she ends up losing. They do. Yeah.
Oh.
They beat him halfway through the season.
Oh, that's awesome.
The last 3 episodes. And actually, I don't know if you knew who ends up killing the Night King,
I don't.
but it's Arya.
Oh, that's why everyone was blowing up about Arya.
Yeah.
I
So,
see all these
so
things
Arya,
trying
so
to-
Arya Stark is Jon Snow's sister. She's one of the few surviving
Wait,
Starks.
did she do it with Sting? Or
She doesn't do it with Sting. She has this obsidian dagger, and she does the trick that she used when she was. So she joined this group of assassins called the Faceless Men.
Yeah.
And actually, it's a big throwback. But she meets Melisandre, this priest of the Lord of Light, early on.
Yeah.
And there's this character who dies like 13 times and keeps getting brought back to life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sir, I can't remember his name, but
But he serves the Lord of Light.
yeah, but he serves the Lord of Light and he keeps being brought back. And when she first meets Arya, she says, you know, you will close many eyes, you will put many eyes to sleep for good. Green eyes, brown eyes, and blue eyes. And everyone thinks the blue eyes are in reference to Cersei. But like Melisandre reminds her of this, and it's at that exact moment she remembers. She looks and sees the White Walkers with blue eyes, and she remembers, oh my gosh. And then,
If she kills the White Walker, they
and
all
the reason
sleep.
they all die. If the Night King dies, they all die. And so she realizes this, and it's this really powerful scene where that character like sacrifices himself. Like he's been brought back many, many times, and he sacrifices himself to save Arya. And then Melisandre's there, and she's like, he was kept by the Lord of Light for a purpose, and that purpose has been served.
Oh wow.
And it was to exist to save her in that moment. And then she does the trick that she has, where she has a dagger in one hand, and she goes and she like jumps from behind him, and he turns around and catches her by one hand, and like holds her by the throat and holds her dagger hand, and then she drops the dagger from her hand into the other and does that trick she used to defeat that girl from Faceless Men. Like where she tricks him, she drops the dagger, catches it, stabs him, and he bursts into the ice, and they all die.
Wow.
And so like she becomes this very pivotal thing. And like the very cool line that she uses is she's like, "What do we do when we like stare the god of death in the face?" And she says, "Not today." And so she says that, and it's a reminder that she's living for life, right? And that like we shouldn't. But that's kind of a side tangent. But that's kind of what happens.
Yeah, that's
and
awesome.
It's a really powerful moment. And I think Arya, like there's a moment where Arya, and this is like Arya's redemption, she wants to kill Cersei.
Yeah.
And so in the final episode, everything's getting destroyed, and I'll explain what happens there. But she's marching in the Hound, who was someone she left for dead, and ended up being alive. There's this one like kind of knight character, looks at her, he's going to face his brother. And she looks at him and she's like going to kill Cersei, and he's like, "If you stay here, you'll die." And she's like, "Whatever." And he's like, "No, you'll become like me." And he's like burnt and like so dead set on vengeance. And he's like, and so basically convinces her not to go kill Cersei because
He himself has had quite a redemption too.
he has, yeah. And he ends up actually defeating his brother by sacrificing himself. But they both die. But it's like this sacrifice, and he does it because his brother's like undefeatable.
Yeah. He's like
He's like an
a
undead
zombie,
creature
basically.
thing, yeah. And so he gets like stabbed in the head and like still lives. Like,
Yeah.
The only way to kill him is through fire, which is like funny
Which is
because
so
the
ironic.
Hound is funny, is scared of fire.
because his older brother burned his
face. Yeah, and so he's so hell bent on redemption, like on revenge, that he kind of looks at Arya and he's like, "Look, like revenge has consumed you, and you need to stop. Like, if you continue to follow this revenge, you will die in this castle."
But he doesn't stop.
He doesn't stop himself, but Arya like finally realizes, "Yeah, I will die here," and that's not my like. And so she has this like redemption about her. And so in the very end, she does what she says she was going to do after it's all done. She's going to see what's west of Westeros. And so she's on a ship, and she's like off exploring. And she like sails off.
Really?
Yeah.
And that's how
her
arc
story
ends?
ends, yeah.
Oh,
And she goes
that's
west
so
of
cool.
Westeros. She's like, what's west of Westeros? It says no one knows. She's like, all the maps stop.
Yeah.
She's like, I'm going to find out.
Because there's Estos or
So that's where she goes. But I want to get back to Daenerys Targaryen.
Yeah, sorry.
Because her story, she's so championed, and everyone loves her.
because of the freedom.
Because of the freedom and the things she does. And then at the very end, people are like, oh, like she completely switches character, right? Because she becomes like the Mad King almost.
So just context for those of you who don't watch it. So she is the daughter of the former king who was declared the Mad King.
Because he said burn them all. He went insane.
He was going to burn everyone. And she fled with her family, and the rest of her family was killed, and she was sold off to a barbarian to basically get access to the barbarian's army, and then she ended up ruling that army and used it to free a bunch of slaves over in Essos, which is this other nation. And by freeing the slaves, they all joined her as well, and it accumulated this massive army, which then she sailed across.
Yeah.
Then joined Jon,
And she lost half of it in the war with the undead.
which makes sense.
And they go to King's Landing. And this is really, really important. And she's struggling because she just finds out that Jon Snow is actually Aegon Targaryen,
Which is her nephew.
And actually the true-born heir, because Rhaegar was next in line for the throne and was killed. And he
Which is
married
her older brother.
Lyanna Stark, who is Ned's sister.
Yep.
And so Ned pretends that it's his bastard, but it's actually his sister's legitimate, because they were legitimately married,
Right.
legitimate son.
But he would have been killed.
But he would have been killed, so he pretended it was his bastard. Because what you find out is the war, which was that Rhaegar kidnapped Lyanna,
But really they had run away together.
but really they had run away together. And so Robert's rebellion was about a spurned love. Because everyone was like, that's not how Rhaegar was. He served the poor, he was a great man. And then somehow they were like, no, he snapped like every other Targaryen does. And but he didn't. And it was an illegitimate war, and an illegitimate thing. I mean, Mad King was bad, but Rhaegar was a good man, would have been a good king. And Jon's very much like his father, and he's very much like he's like very much like both of his fathers, because Ned raised him, and so he's a very kind-hearted man like Rhaegar, but he's got his like the honor of Ned, so he becomes like who should be on the throne, and Dany recognizes this, and obviously he doesn't want it because he doesn't want to lead, and everyone's like, well, that's what makes you make you a good leader, and he basically pulled the realms together to stop the Night King. Like, he's a very great natural leader, but at the very end, like, Dany starts to snap because all of her closest advisors either betray her, like Varys writes to people saying, like, trying to say like Jon is the rightful king and that Dany has no claim to the throne, because he sees Dany like becoming more and more cruel. And the thing that I want to point out with that is people
him actually becoming more influenced.
Yeah, that Tyrion is so on her side because he doesn't want to admit he's wrong, but he eventually sees, like, and I'll explain how that happens, and then he convinces Jon, which is a really sad moment. But
Convinces Jon what?
That she's actually bad, that she's not fit to rule. And the reason that this happens is because she, throughout the entire series, would do things that were very cruel, but they were always the people we disliked. Like her brother, like she was very cold when he was killed because he was a jerk.
Yeah.
Of course he's bad. She burned all of these slavers. Like, yeah, they were slavers. They're terrible. Of course she set fire to them. She killed the witch. Like, of course that was a good thing to do. She set all these people free. And there's one moment in one of the early seasons where she's like, I'm just going to start burning the city. And Tyrion's like, no, look at that. Think of all the people that are in there. And she listens to his counsel and doesn't burn the city.
Well, it's kind of like, what is the scripture passage in Genesis? What if there's 100 good people in the city? Well,
Yeah.
then I'll let the city.
Yeah.
Like, what if there's 10?
Exactly.
What if there's just one?
Right. And what's amazing is you get to that moment and Tyrion's like, if they ring the bells, they've surrendered. Like, because she's like, I'm just going to burn the city with my dragon, because both her two other dragons died. One the Night King killed and had to be turned into a White Walker dragon.
I remember that.
And the other one got killed like right when they were about to attack the city. They had these ballistas and they killed the second dragon.
So which one survived?
Drogon, hers. And Tyrion basically, like, there was this episode where she actually is like, I'm going to attack the city, and he's like, just give them a chance. If they ring the bells, they've surrendered. Mm-hmm. And there's a moment where she is looking out, like Cersei's looking out, and she's so smug, and she refuses to admit that, you know, like there's an army that's bigger than hers outside the gates, and she's like, no one's ever breached like the Red Keep, because like there's the outer walls and the Red Keep, and it's true because no one breached it. Even in Robert's Rebellion, they didn't breach it. It was Jaime who killed the Mad King.
It was from the inside.
It was from the inside. It was an internal rebellion. And so what ends up happening is she comes through with this dragon and just kills. They like hired this mercenary company, and she sets the mercenary company on fire and just blows up the front gate. And so all of her army can just march right into the city. And it's at that exact moment that all the Lannisters are like, we're completely overrun. We no longer have the outer wall. And so they start ringing the bells. And she's looking at the Red Keep, and she no longer trusts Tyrion because Tyrion told
Jon.
Well, Tyrion told Varys, who then betrayed her. Jon told her sister, or Tyrion only found out because Jon had told her sisters, who told Tyrion, who told Varys, who wanted to tell the realm. And so she didn't trust any of them anymore. And you see her like beginning to snap, and she's been cold, and like she no longer listened to that, and she starts burning the city, including all the innocents. And it's whenever that first happens that like they're like, we need to go. They breach the city, and Cersei, with her pride, says, no one's ever breached the Red Keep. Like, they have this dragon and everything, and she thinks like, because she lets all the commoners into the Red Keep to like prevent Dany from destroying it.
Oh, she does let them come in.
She lets him come in because she's using him as a shield, because she's like, Dany will never kill the innocent. And she says, no one's ever bridged the Red Keep. And she like knows that. She's mentioned that that's actually her plot. It's like using him as a shield. And she's like incredibly prideful. She's watching this army march, and she's like, I'm willing to sacrifice all these people for it. Dany unfortunately snaps and burns the whole city. And Cersei, for the first time, like, begins to be afraid because she realizes this is in the whole. She burns the castle to the ground, like not completely to the ground, but like destroys parts of the castle, and she just kills all these innocents. And Tyrion's like, you kill these innocents, and he quits his hand of the king, hand of the queen, because he even was willing to let her like admit she was wrong, and she was like, no, I did the right thing. People got so mad, they're like, that's so outside of Dany's character. But Tyrion ends up talking to Jon to try to convince him. And she's like, she's my queen, and this is her decision to make, all this stuff. And he's like, when she killed these tyrants, she was just as cool then, just as like ruthless. But we cheered her on because they were people we didn't like. Now it's innocent.
Saying all this?
Yeah, and he's like, now it's innocent, and we're seeing who she truly is. And she's always been like her father. It's just, it always was people we didn't like. And so it reminds me of like false prophets.
Yeah.
That there will be many false prophets. There will be people that we look at and we're like, oh man, this is the right person, this is the good person. But we neglect to see that it's not just about who they're doing these things to, but about what they're doing.
Yeah. This actually reminds me of something Gordon said about, I don't remember what we were talking about at the time, but he talked about how a lot of the times when someone comes to us with their problems and like it's an issue with another person, we always side with the person that we love.
Yeah.
Right? So if you came to me and someone at work was like just doing something to you and you told me your side of the story, chances are I'd probably side with you just because that's who we are as like fallen people.
Yeah.
But in reality, that's only half the story.
Right.
You know, like we're only seeing like this part of it rather than seeing maybe the other person's actually right and maybe the person that I love is wrong in this, and I just don't I'm not seeing the full picture here. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what's happening here too, but in a different way.
And it's true. And what finally convinces Jon, because he is so dedicated to her until the end.
Yeah.
Because he's just so loyal character, and he's just he's willing to even forego, he's willing to even forgive what she did to that city if she would admit that it was wrong. And so he goes to her because she's like announcing we're going to continue onward, and they
continue on where?
To all the other realms, to all the other kingdoms, because it's the 7 kingdoms, and she's going to go to all the other castles and put all the lords in line and burn all the cities.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and so she's willing to continue to do it with the Dothraki. She's like, I told you, because she said this from the beginning. She was like, you would tear down their stone houses, and all of these sorts of things she's been telling the Dothraki, and she continues to say it to the Dothraki. And so he goes to her, and she's so convinced that she's right that she doesn't even see that it's wrong. And he's like, but what if and this is I think a beautiful, beautiful moment. And he was like, the realm doesn't need more war. It needs a reign of mercy. And it says this to her. And she's like, it will have mercy just as soon as we're done breaking the wheel. And once we destroy what is, then we can rebuild it with mercy. And he's like, how do you know you're right? What about all the other people who say they're right? And she's like, well, they don't get a say. They're not the queen.
Right.
I get to determine what's right. And it's that. She's like, are you my... He's like, you're my queen always and forever. And he stabs her.
He stabs her. Oh, wow.
And that's how it ends. And it's sad because both of the women he's loved, he's had to kill out of duty. Because there's this line that he says, where he says that love is the death of duty. And Tyrion's like, did you make that up? And he's like, no, I heard it from Maester, who Aemon or whatever years ago.
Who was a Targaryen.
And he says, and Tyrion kind of listens, and he says, and sometimes duty is the death of love. Mm. And it's this really powerful thing where, unfortunately, he's had to do that. He's forsaken this love for, what's best for everybody, even though it's not even a thing. And so Drogon comes up with the dragon and, sees Dany die. He, nudges her, and it's this really sad moment because it's his mother.
Yeah.
And he goes to breathe fire, but instead of breathing it on Jon, which everyone's like, why would he do that? He melts the Iron Throne. And it shows that Drogon's smart. And he realizes, as much as Jon's done this, this has all happened because of this lust for this Iron Throne, and he's fulfilling
That's why everyone's saying Drogon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because Drogon is actually intelligent, is what they're showing, is that he fulfilled his mother's wishes and broke the wheel. He's like, well, this throne has caused all of these seasons of horrible atrocities to happen, and it's led to the death of his mother, and so he melts it. And at that moment, Jon is sent back to, like, very end, Jon's sent back to the Night's Watch. So they have to elect a king. And the Unsullied and all of Dany's army controls King's Landing. And so Tyrion and Jon are under their custody. All of the most powerful lords of the realm convene, you know, like, who should be king? And they're like, well, who's, like, the most legitimate? Sam says, why don't we, like, basically, he pitches democracy and he's ridiculed. But they were like, there will no longer be a king that's selected by bloodline, but all of the kingdoms of the realm will come together and will vote on our own king. And so that's what happens. They actually elect Bran.
Really?
And they call him Bran the Broken because this is, I think, kind of going with our podcast. They say, what brings people together? Is it money? Is it power? What is it? Is it, you know, this great leadership? Like, what brings people together? And Tyrion's like, it's a good story. He says, who's a better story than Bran the Broken?
Because he can see the future and the past.
Because he can see it all, and he's this boy who was thrown from the top of the tower in a broken, paralyzed boy that's in a wheelchair, went north of the wall by himself, faced the Night King and came back.
Yeah.
Right? And they were like, who's a better story than that? And so they elect him king, and the Unsullied won't like they want to execute Jon, and they compromise by saying they'll send him to the Night's Watch, which is actually kind of what he wants. Because one of the things is there's Ghost, who is a direwolf that belongs to Jon, and they're very connected. And right after the final battle with the Night King, he sends him north of the wall with the wildlings, and he says he'll be happier there, which is kind of like Jon saying, I would be happier there. And so when he gets to Castle Black, where the Night's Watch is, he finds that it's just all the wildlings. So he goes north of the wall, because earlier in the season, Tormund says, you're always welcome north of the wall. He's like, you've got the north in you, the real north.
What's the point of the Night's Watch if the White Walkers are dead?
According to Tyrion, he's like, there's always going to be a place for the outcasts and the bastards.
So it's just a place.
Yeah. And so basically then he goes and he goes north of the wall and becomes this wildling, right? Which is like kind of what he always wanted a little bit, because he's never wanted to rule, he just wanted to live simply.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like what ends up happening. He kind of like becomes like the king north of the wall almost, but Sansa doesn't rejoin, becomes the Six Realms, and she is queen in the north.
Okay.
And so this is kind of like a little bit of wrap up for him, for Clint. But the themes that I think really run through are just like what the lust for power does to us, and like I think the false prophet. And I think that ultimately is what it is. And I think it's important because everyone wanted Jon to sit on the throne. But one of the things about this show is that it's not always about like what may seem like the happiest ending, because Jon was brought back by the Lord of Light because he was going to be the one that defeated the Night King in terms of like bringing everyone together that needed to be.
The other guy that was brought back, like you said, like 12 or 13 times, was brought back
to save Arya.
Yeah.
And so it's sad because like the Stark children are all gone off and they'll probably never see each other again. But I think that there is something in that shows like Jon could have become a king, right? Because the Unsullied eventually leave. Like he could have demanded to sit on the throne, but he was like obedient and he was like, no, go back. That he was the one character who didn't lust after the power, and that he went back to this very simple life, and that's always what he wanted, right? That he was this great defender of man, right? That he probably was the prince that was promised, the one who defeated the night. And in the end, he's like, I just want to return humbly back to this life that I want to lead. Because he almost became a wildling earlier in the series.
Right.
And it wasn't until he came face to face with the White Walkers that he said, I have to leave this, what I really want. What I really want is to live here north of the wall. But I have to leave it and return to the realms of men to save everyone. And so I just want to kind of get your thoughts on all of that, and any other like themes that you think would be important.
Yeah, I think we hit on most of the stuff that I'm thinking of right now. I do like that you said Tyrion had a huge part in like bringing the truth to light, which, based off of what I said at the beginning, I think that's a huge part of just his story arc and showing the real redemption. Yeah, I think what you described to me actually sounds pretty fitting. I know a lot of people have been upset with everything. Maybe I would be too if I saw it. I don't know. But based off what you're saying, it fits. I think things make sense.
Well, I think it's important to remember like what George R. R. Martin really was doing with the show. Like part of the reason that I think a lot of people have issues with like some of the morally bad things, like morally black stuff that happens in the show, is that George R. R. Martin's ultimately trying to show like what real war and real life when people succumb to the worst passions, right? And so that's coupled with great stories of redemption, and like great stories of good people. And at the end, it's really a story against the light and the dark. But it's not just a story of like life versus death, good versus evil, but it's also reflecting with the Game of Thrones, like outside of the Night King arc, is reflecting like the struggle that people have within themselves and like the struggle of being a good person versus succumbing to our self-interest and hatred and evil.
Yeah. Well, we talk about this sometimes. I think we talked about it a little bit on last week's episode, or no, it was a couple weeks ago with Chris, how in fantasy, a lot of the times we exaggerate certain things to kind of get a point across, and a lot of times what's exaggerated in stuff like this that we like is good and evil, and so we have this clear good and this clear evil. And I don't think we necessarily have that in Game of Thrones. Like everyone, like we see good and evil in all these different people. We see humanity at its worst, but we also see like hope. We see the light, like you're talking about, and we see kind of all the good that can come from it. We talked about it again on that episode on Tolkien, the eucatastrophe, the good that comes from the awful catastrophe, the evil, and that's what the Christian life is about. Right? That's what the good news is.
Also, I think it's important to remember. So the Lord of Light, which again, like even their priestess, right? Their priests like do some horrible things, right? Assassinations and using like dark magic sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, you have this Lord of Light that is using even the most broken people to overcome an even greater evil. And like that's kind of what God does with us. Like he doesn't ever choose like the righteous, but he's choosing the broken and leading us on a path of redemption to fight in the spiritual war. And I think like that is an important thing that I think people miss. You know?
Yeah.
That even these really terrible, like what seem to be sometimes terrible characters, in the end end up having great things. And actually one of the saddest parts is that Jaime at the very end, like, has the choice of staying with Brienne of Tarth, who he's fallen in love with, and it's revealed in the final season. But whenever they're marching the army south to defeat Cersei, he leaves and he goes to Cersei, and he dies with Cersei. And it's this really sad thing where in one aspect you're kind of like, man, for all of the redemption that he's had, you know, like he went back to it.
Yeah.
But I think that actually there was something beautiful in that, because he always had to live with being the Kingslayer. He was a Kingsguard and protected with him, tasked and honor bound to protect the Mad King. And in the end, he went back to being a Queen's Guard and he died with his queen.
Yeah. But it also goes to show, like, even after our redemption, we can still fall again.
Yeah.
And so
we can still
need to
easily
stay
go
patient.
back. And actually his line there is he was like, she's a hateful woman and I'm hateful too. And then he leaves. And it's like, he just goes back to his old self.
Yeah.
And I think that that's like, kind of shows like, even like Judas, right? Like Judas and Peter, they both committed the same sin. One redeemed. Like, repented. One redempted.
One redempted. That works. It's getting late.
Yeah.
Speaking of which.
Anything else? I think that's pretty much all I have to cover.
Do you have a challenge?
Yeah, so I do. I think this week, I'm going to give you guys like a real challenge. I mean, it's always a real challenge, but like this one I feel like kind of can be tough because it requires a lot of introspection
Okay.
and then an action based on that. I want you guys to sit down in some prayer, get some silent prayer, like a really just one-on-one with God. And I want you to ask Him and reflect really deeply on all of the times, as best that you can, remembering all the times that God has given you mercy. Like all the times that we stumbled, we fall, and that God fallen, and that God has forgiven us and given us mercy, even in times where we're like, I don't deserve this mercy. And then once we're like remembering all of that, I think you guys should go out and do an act of mercy.
Yeah.
Give that gift of forgiveness and mercy to somebody else. And there's a bunch of corporal and spiritual works of mercy. You can pick one of those to do. But I want you, I think, like, maybe you say, okay, I'm going to do this corporal work of mercy, and before you go do that service or before you do that prayer with a spiritual work of mercy, you reflect on the mercy God's given you right before you do it, so that it's fresh in your mind, so that it can be a more redemptive experience for you and that other person.
I want to add another challenge
Yeah.
in there too, if I can. Obviously, there are a lot of people who watch this show. We talked about at the beginning how our hope for this episode especially was that you can find someone in your life that you can try and have this discussion with. And we barely touched even the tip of the iceberg on stuff that we would talk about with Game of Thrones. And so my challenge for you is to find someone to have this conversation with. I would recommend not going straight into like as deep as we have just gone, but just like say, hey, I heard about this character Tyrion. What do you think about it?
Yeah.
And if they say, like, I like him, then maybe there's something there. Maybe that's a doorway where you can start saying, well, what do you like about it? And from there, you can start talking about this beauty of redemption. And there's so many different ways you can go about it, but that's just one example. So my challenge for you is find one of the many million or billion, I don't know how many people watch the show, it's a ton of people who watch, and start that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys, again for joining us on the adventure. Yeah, just really quickly before we get into like shout outs.
Yeah.
Again, if you enjoyed this episode, please let people know. And we're going to give a few shout outs, and maybe you'll appear in the shout outs with new people. But obviously, if you guys enjoy this, that you will help spread the word and that we're doing something good for you guys. But I don't really have a particular shout out this week. I could probably shout out Chris Donato. Met with him recently. He's a pretty good observation. It's good to see him again.
Yeah. We got a couple shout outs for some new listeners here. So Landon Lynn and Paolo Pigato. I don't know how you would say that, but it sounds super Italian. And then welcome back to a couple listeners who have been listening quite a bit. So Ben Balto and Bev Koo. So thank you guys. Welcome back. Thanks for checking stuff out.
You guys, thanks again for joining us on the adventure. Reminder, if you like this, other than telling all of your friends about us, follow us on social media, reach out to us, continue the conversation with us, let us know what you're listening to and what you guys want to hear from us.
Twitter @OnTheAdventure, Facebook, The Christian Culture, YouTube, The Christian Culture. And if you like what we do, Steve, where can people support us?
You can support us on Patreon.
Patreon, and you can go to The Christian Culture. If you want access to our blogs and everything else that we do, our videos and all that stuff, go check out our website. We also have a whole page on there with just different resources of stuff where you can learn how to do the TCIC thing, the Christian Culture thing.
So check out our website.
Yeah, just go check it out. So it's thechristianculture.com. And the notes for all this stuff is in the subsection of it.
Okay. Also, really quickly, how many patrons do we have right now?
We currently have 3.
3. If we can get 7 more and get up to 10 patrons, I promise that I will actually write a blog.
Hopefully we can get some blogs from Steve before then.
Yes. Well, I will write blogs before then, hopefully. But I'm challenging you guys. If you do support us and we get up to 10, I am honor bound to actually write.
Jon Snow. But one thing I should mention, we said that for the first 5 people, each of the patrons would get to choose an episode for themselves. So they get to choose a topic. No one gets to see it for those first 5 people. We still have 2 more slots. So if you want to be one of the first 5 to get a special episode just for yourself, please join soon.
And thanks, guys, for joining us.